Good evening, everyone. It is such a joy to be here. The idea that everyone is gathered here talking about themes which really cover so many of the human rights themes that we talk about is such an inspiring event, so it's lovely to be here with you tonight. Let's see how this works. Oh, good. So welcome to our discussion really about human rights this evening. When we talk about human rights, we are really needing to define what they are for us all. I've been listening tonight throughout the evening, and all the different topics we're talking about, equality and dignity and justice and peace, have been covered, and it's amazing because it's exactly what human rights is all about. Now, I want you to imagine a world for a moment where these rights don't exist. It's really not that hard to imagine a place on our planet today where we can imagine that the lives of everyone that exists in that place are treated exactly the same. We strive for that. We write about this in our legal practices and in our constitutional agreements and in our universal declarations that we create, but it doesn't exist yet. It doesn't exist yet. And so when we think about that as our human race, when we're talking about all these rights, and tonight's discussion, I'm going to focus really about this human right, about movement. Our right to freely move about our lovely planet so that we actually can achieve the human dignity that we were all born with the right to achieve, but which is somehow denied some of us today. So when we think about the idea of human rights, and we think about them being for all, truly for all of us, these are just some of the ideas I really wanted to talk about. The idea that human dignity, which is written about in our Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So walk back in time with me. It's 1945. The end of, thank goodness, the end of the Second World War has arrived. And we're looking at huge numbers of loss, more loss than the world had ever experienced in our modern history. And when we consider the numbers, the sheer numbers, and the way that those lives were lost with the introduction of military equipment, policies of National Socialism, it's really not that hard to imagine the trauma that some argue is still with us today in our generational DNA. That trauma shocked humanity, really shocked humanity. We had never before experienced the same level of trauma as we had in the 6 years of the war. And I would argue that it was even the 10 years before that and the 20 years before that. It's leading from the First World War and the hundreds of years and centuries that humans have really not been very kind to one another. It isn't a new concept. It was just such a huge scale of death and loss that something had to be done. So we had the Declaration of Human Rights enter our existence. Thank you, Eleanor Roosevelt. And she was able to then drive home this message that if we don't write down a moral code of how humans should treat one another, we may, as history tends to do, repeat itself, and we may experience this again. So when we talk about this human dignity, which is mentioned in the preamble of the UDHR, we're really talking about that idea. We're talking about human beings with their human needs, our basic human needs, that goes on and it has evolved, of course, now to include things like human connection, communication, and dare I say, love. Can I say that? And have it be accepted as something that we see now today as actually a human need. Psychology has shown us that that's actually what we need. And our human rights and the structure that we now see in our constitutions actually can show us that these legal frameworks help us to protect our human need. Right? So this is the relationship we have, but interconnected to all of that is human dignity. And what's in the center? Love, our human value. during the Second World War and the previous wars that the world had all seen, I just watched the Napoleon film, 3 million killed. It's unbelievable to think about those numbers. When we think about how we can treat one another and the choice that we have, it really is all about borders. When we think about our physical borders and our ideological borders that we've ever considered, it really comes down to who's allowed in and who do we keep out. And that really shouldn't be a question anymore, right? I mean, we understand that pie, that big pie that we all are so worried about losing our piece from is big enough to feed us all, right? The piece of the pie that we all require maybe has gotten smaller, or maybe the pie just has exponentially grown with our population. But either way, we do know now that the pie is big enough. We still, though, hold on to really old-fashioned ideas, ideologically, and then, of course, the fight for our physical borders. So let's walk back through time a little bit. We're still there. In 1939, we want to think this is actually in the US. Now, this ship was full of Jewish immigrants, and they were attempting to enter the US at the rise, of course, of the Nazi Party, and they were denied. Now, at the time, the US didn't have, because the term refugee actually didn't exist. But in 1924, they had created an immigrant policy. And within this document, they used the term desirable humans. Desirable. Can you imagine? It's like a pair of shoes. How could we ever think about human beings as being described as desirable or undesirable, for if they're going to be allowed into your country or not? But I would argue that we're still using that term, aren't we? Maybe not as overtly using that term, but it certainly is the feeling felt by so many immigrants and refugees today. But it was during the Second World War that we actually were introduced to that term refugee. So my slides unfortunately haven't updated, but the difference between an immigrant and a refugee is choice. An immigrant leaves because they're looking for economic or educational opportunity. But a refugee is forced. They're forced because of war, they're forced because of famine, or some other natural disaster. And when they're forced to leave, to go back to that definition of human rights being for us all, they actually have the right to leave. They have the freedom of movement to find safety and security elsewhere, but they sometimes get to a border that isn't very welcoming. And that border then stops them from happening, and it's here at the border where actually we see the majority of our human rights violations. Even today. It has improved. I don't like doom and gloom, so we will hopefully show a little bit more positivity and optimism, because it's true that we do live in a safer world. Because of the Second World War and its effects on us collectively, I'd say, we actually have much better policy today than we ever have before. Even if, please put your phones down and look at the headlines, even if we read the newspaper, we can find positive stories of the increased amounts of immigrants and refugees that are traveling abroad. And they need to, because the amount of displaced people on our planet is exponentially growing. We're at 75 million now, and they estimate by 2050 that number could be closer to 200 million displaced people across the globe for various reasons. And they really need safety and security. They need to know that the place where they're going to land is safer than the place that they left. That's the reason why you maybe have seen this poster or this meme online, that a mother would never place her child in a boat to send them to a foreign land where she doesn't speak the language or know the culture or the food, if the land she was leaving was safe enough. Right? We wouldn't do that to ourselves, and we wouldn't do that to our children unless we were really searching and had a need to look for that safety. So if you look here at this image, you can see that what's happening just here across Europe is very interesting. You can see where people are coming from. I won't talk you through it, you can see. But they're estimating here 40,000 asylum seekers, and that's a whole new range of humans that we're trying to calculate and make new rules for. Are these asylum seekers, those also who have left from fear of war or famine or conflict, and their lives are at risk. And there's through our different UN conventions now, the Convention for the Rights of the Refugees, all of these different conventions now that we have are here to actually try and help the situation. But we know that in Italy and Greece, it's still awful. It is still awful. The camps that are there, this physical border, the first place actually that starts out in the waterways before you even reach Greece or Italy, are points of question. Can I help them? Those desirables or those undesirables? Am I able to offer them aid? And can you imagine that that's the world we live in today, where I'm questioning whether or not I'm actually legally able to help a fellow human being? Now, if I was stood next to someone, I would help them. So it is a little bit about proximity, but we do have organizations who are helping. And I really ask that we all keep our eye out for those positive stories of people who are willing to risk their own lives, not just by donating money, not just by donating even their time, but physically going and making sure that humans are safe and feel protected. That is actually happening all the time. Let me point that out. It's all the time. People are helping because we still need people to help. We still need people to help. And we still need to offer, through our ideological ideas that we share amongst our friends and our politicians, we can still lobby for those basic fundamentals of universality, human dignity, and equality when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants, all alike, because they're all human. Right? They're all human. In the UDHR, it's actually very explicitly written out. Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. It really is our duty that when we come across not just our physical border issues within human rights, but our physiological and ideological borders that we're up against, that those conversations do take place close to home. And when people start making a discriminatory comment and make bold statements like, those refugees may take our jobs, they may remove opportunity from us and take a bigger piece of that pie, it really is up to all of us to remind them that the pie is big. We don't need that much to eat. And we can really all help. Because if you don't, who will? Thank you so much for listening.